World History, Chapter 1, Prehistory, Part 2 of the discussion. Biggest change in prehistory happens around 8000 BCE or 10,000 years ago, and that's the agricultural or Neolithic Revolution. Well, first, most of human history, from the beginning of humans about 200 to 90,000 years ago, up to about 10,000 years ago, was spent hunting and gathering, usually in bands of just 30 to 50 people. They'd go hunt, gather, and fish, and basically follow the herds around, migrate with the seasons, no landed property, basically very egalitarian. Women had a high status in these hunter-gatherer societies. They usually gathered the berries and the fruits while the men would go hunt the big game. And yes, meat was very prized, so men were high up there. But sometimes when the hunt failed, women would bring home all the veggies and the fruits and sustain the society. So women had a very high status in hunter-gatherer societies compared to what we have today. Actually, today, about 30,000 of our 8+ billion population still hunts and gathers, especially places like the Amazon rainforest and some of the deserts of Africa. But for the most part, that's way less than 1% of the current population. But anthropologists try to study modern hunter-gatherers to try to figure out, well, this is what pretty much all of humanity was like before agriculture. However, a big change happens. Oh, by the way, Paleolithic and Neolithic. Paleolithic actually means Old Stone Age, and Neolithic means New Stone Age because the stones were sharper and more precise, and they were made for agriculture. Just to clear that up, but the real difference between the Paleolithic era before 8000 BCE versus the Neolithic era since 8000 BCE is agriculture. Agriculture is indirectly going to be exactly what leads us to civilization. So you start getting cities and towns and people settling in one place, landed property becoming more important because people want to go invade places that have all the resources. You have warfare, which is probably a big part of why men become very dominant. You start getting patriarchy in society. But anyway, just going back to it, I thought I'd mention hunting and gathering makes me think of the story of Jacob and Esau in the Bible. I know they're both men, but basically, long story short, Esau goes on the hunt, so he's like the hunter guy, and Jacob's more like the gatherer, you could say. But Esau doesn't catch anything on the hunt, and Jacob has all the food, which I'm guessing is vegetables and other stuff. And so Esau begs Jacob to give him a meal because he's starving. And then Esau says, well, you got to give up your birthright. Or no, yeah, that's what happens. So Esau gives up his birthright to get a meal from Jacob, and Jacob steals. And this is in Genesis in the Bible, but it's very much kind of how hunting and gathering worked. Yeah, meat was very prized, and men were the ones that brought down the big animals, but women more consistently found food with berries, and women probably even started the Neolithic agricultural revolution when they started capturing plants and figuring out how to domesticate them and plant them and make them regrow, which led to settled agriculture and the idea of property and the idea of amassing wealth, and things became less egalitarian. And that's why cities like Jericho built walls to sustain themselves. Oh, here comes a Trump joke. We're going to build a wall, and we're going to make, I guess, the people outside of Jericho pay for it. Now, if you remember Jericho in the Bible, we're actually going to get to that Jericho in the very next chapter. That's around, if you look at Bible timelines, I believe that's around 1400 BCE or so, the one where Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. This is a different Jericho with walls that maybe didn't come tumbling down. This is like 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, so way, way older than the Jericho in the Bible, although in a similar area in the Middle East. And you had Catalhaic also in this era, like 7,000 BCE or so, and it was mysteriously abandoned. And I told you about hunter-gatherer bands of 30 to 50 people. Now you got cities like Jericho with 2,000 people and Catalhaic with 5,000 people, so population can grow. This is another reason probably why women had a lower status when you hit this Neolithic revolution, because then women are responsible for having babies, and it's important to grow the population because women are at home nursing babies. You don't see them out gathering as much. But men partially contributed to the Neolithic revolution too by capturing animals and figuring out how to domesticate them. Think about like cows, totally an invention of humans. I'm saving my cow nightmare story for ancient Egypt in a couple chapters. You'll see where it fits in with the mummy story. I'm not going to go there yet. But anyway, basically, now people are in settled villages. This would not have been possible, though, before the end of the Ice Age, because I mentioned on the human migration map, and you can see it like when sea levels were a lot lower, because of the Ice Age, people could migrate over Siberia, and they did, all the way down to southern South America. Once the ice melted, though, the climate warmed up, it got rainier, and it got a lot more stable. And as a result, people could settle down and cultivate stuff, because they couldn't have done that. They might have like a good crop one year, but then they'd have a terrible crop the next year, and the weather was super unpredictable before about 8,000 BCE. In fact, that brings up something kind of scary. If you look at big history and geology and weather and Earth's fluctuations, Earth goes through periods like this, but they're very short in geological time, and I believe, and I might be kind of making this up, but I believe they kind of last about 10,000 years, so we might be near the end of this nice stable period coming out of the Ice Age before things get chaotic again in terms of Earth's climate and maybe don't favor humans and settlement as much. But I'm going off on tangents. That's what this is supposed to do. This is supposed to lead to discussion, and it does. So another interesting thing, and this is going to come back to bite us, or sadly it's going to come back to bite this region, South America, North America, and the Pacific Islands in a long time from now, in about 1500 CE and beyond. In the past 500 years, about 500, 400 years ago, it's going to come back to bite us. But I'm going to throw this little bug in right now. In North America, many of the animals were hunted into extinction. Mammoths, mastodons, and horses. Yes, there were horses up here, but here's a cool trick question. When you think about Native Americans of the 19th century, you think of them as having horses, but those horses from thousands of years ago all went extinct. The only horses were on this part of the world. We're going to talk about them a lot in the very next chapter when we talk about Indo-European migrations in Eurasia. And, of course, the climax of people on horseback, which you're going to see a lot of nomads on horseback up here invading civilizations down here from China to Iran to Turkey and so on. But the climax of that is the Mongols in the 1200s CE that take over Eurasia with their horses, and then their empire collapses in less than 100 years. But the horses in North America that we think of when we think of Native American history, they didn't come over here till 1519 with Cortez when he invaded Mexico with his Spanish army. Some of the horses got loose, spread up here. But here's where I'm going. The big agricultural revolution, as you can see, was mostly in Southwest Asia and also in the Eastern Hemisphere in general. But around 4000 BCE, there was another agricultural revolution on the total opposite side of the world with corn in Mesoamerica and potatoes in the Andes Mountains. And when we get to the Columbian Exchange, that's chapter 22, Age of Exploration, 1500 CE, you're going to see that the world population will more than double in the same 3 centuries that the largest demographic collapse in history, which is the Western Hemisphere, also happens. That is, more than 99% of the Native American population in North and South America die off. But why does that die off? Why does the population more than double? Stuff like the potato especially, that gets over to the Eastern Hemisphere and it greatly enriches people's diets. But why does most of the Western Hemisphere die out? Disease. Well, what causes disease? A lot of times, domesticated animals. And then, of course, humans in contact with people who aren't immune. Think about COVID just back in 2020. But most of the animals that got domesticated were over here, cows and pigs and sheep. The only animal that got domesticated on this side, big animal, was the llamas and alpacas. And so as a result, you had way less disease over here because there were way fewer domesticated animals to spread the disease compared to in the Eastern Hemisphere. But then, post-1492 in Columbus, the diseases from here come over here to people who aren't immune to it and wipe out over 99% of that population. I'm getting way ahead. That happens way, way later, but I just thought I would throw that in. Another interesting thing is that people think of the Neolithic Revolution as a revolution, but how revolutionary was it? Well, in some ways, life wasn't as good as for hunting and gathering. Hunting and gathering, you only work like maybe 4 hours a day or something. But when you start farming, that's hard work. Hard work to plow the fields, clear the land. But what it did do is it allowed agricultural surplus. It allowed for lots of food. And it allowed for populations to boom. And that was huge. In fact, I'm going to look at populations because that's pretty cool to see through time. Basically, if you go way back to when the agricultural revolution started, 10,000 years ago, or 8,000 BCE, I guess 10,000 BCE, population only 4 million. But then when you get to 5,000 BCE, population 5 million. But watch it boom. 14 million by 3000 BCE. Now we're in the historical era. We'll be talking about that era in the next 2 chapters. And as I say, the next 6 chapters of the ancient world are going to deal with 3500 to 500 BCE. So population at the beginning of this period, around 3000 BCE, is 14 million. And then you get to 2000 BC, 27 million. It's doubled. Then you get to 1000 BCE, and it's doubled again, 50 million. And then this is where it gets interesting. Things get real intense after about 1000 BCE. You will see in the next chapter, you kind of have the Bronze Age collapse in that era, where a bunch of ancient civilizations fall apart to pave way for new ones. And probably we're going to get into all of this. It's all so fascinating. I love this ancient period. But then watch this. Doubles again by 500 BC or 100 million. And that's not even close to the 8 billion we have now. We didn't even reach 1 billion until 1825 CE, literally just 200 years ago. But you're at 100 million in 500 BCE, which is the dawn of the classical era. Huge empires, starting with Achaemenid Persia, start to take over big chunks of the world as more and more people get into settled agriculture. So anyway, those are just some cool thoughts. And at the end, you see a bit of a timeline here at the end of the chapter. And the very next discussion is going to be on the invention of writing and how that's what really moves us out of prehistory into history.